Okay, so this is going to be a bit different than usual. Um, I'm going to be reading from a script, so if my eyes are up there, um, it's because I'm not just going off the cuff like I usually do. So, like I said in the title, and I'm going to start reading the script I've got there. Screw it, spoilers for everything. It will be more of an analysis than a review, so bear with me. Okay, let's do a thought exercise. I want you to imagine we are 3,000 years in the future. A library gets buried in some sort of cataclysm like Pompeii somewhere in the US or Canada. Everything's sealed up for those millennia. The texts survive, but in fragments. Our language, English, dies or evolves in the meantime. Given how much it evolved from the point it was 1,000 years ago, doubtlessly it'll be far different to our own, and translation will be required. Video and films don't really survive in this alternate future of ours, so they don't have those clues. All they have is the texts themselves. Included among them are scripts from TV shows, books from decades of fiction, etc., etc. The question is, what are they to make of, say, Inspector Morse, Sherlock Holmes, and Poirot? If the texts are damaged enough, how do you tell the difference between true crime and mystery slash police procedural fiction? If the introduction, annotations, and other clues to their fictional nature are removed, then what would a future professor of history or ancient literature think of the proceedings? How would we differentiate an author in this ancient language we call modern English talking about real life murder or theft and Agatha Christie, Arthur Conan Doyle, or Colin Dexter making it up? If all we have are the passages of the fictional stories themselves, it is extraordinarily difficult to judge what is meant to come across as real because it is real, and what comes across as real because the writer did their job, particularly if we don't know the language idioms well. Invoking historical accuracy for the Odyssey gets even more complicated when we realize we're not simply dealing with a contemporary account, fictional or non fictional. We're dealing with a mythologized account set down after centuries of a dark age in which writing systems actually collapsed. So the only tales Homer, the alleged composer whose existence is not even certain, could speak of were those passed down to him by others through word of mouth, as those stories were in his lifetime. When our memories become the recollections of our tale, our tales by our children, and those who follow them, when the past becomes a living memory once beheld, slips those bonds and becomes a purely recorded narrative, then even on our own times, there's a kind of fictionalization that can occur if we're not careful. Times past become remembered only in how we dramatize them, only in surviving records, should we bother to pay attention to them at all. If all we know about the past is locked up in movies and TV shows, which are deliberately biased towards the values and sensibilities of the modern day, we can mistakenly get the sense of these past decades being much more like ours and much more sanitized than they really are. I like to call this theme park history. We know the past, but only as a safe and nostalgic version, nothing that would offend us or alienate us remaining. Folks love to harp upon, say, the armor design or the architecture of Greek times, but I don't think you see much of anybody begging to see the toilet habits of Mycenaean Greeks and Homer's epics. One of the theme parks I'd gone to as a kid, Astroworld, had 1900s, 1910 inspired attractions. What those attractions lacked was muddy streets filled with beasts of burden or signs talking about Jim Crow restrictions. We have a nearby Renaissance festival. You certainly aren't confronted with the same livestock smell there either, nor the lord and ladies of other elements of feudal society, or your likely role as a just a peasant digging in the dirt, handling livestock emphasized. No, we get swords and sorcery, fairy tale trappings, LARPing, HEMA, and other purposely romanticized elements of times past. What also gets excluded, I'm betting, is much of the real world variety of those times. People talk about woke casting in terms of Greco Roman times, but black people show up. In fact, the sequel to the Iliad, they show up as reinforcements. Similarly, westerns before the 1990s tend to neglect the fact that a significant fraction of cowboys, of the literal drivers of cattle drivers of old, um, were black people. Much of our idealization of the past is a consequence of the filters of the media of the past. Many people get hung up on political bias in the media, but how about bias built on former male domination or racial bias? I remember during the 90s hearing all about how you couldn't have a film with a minority lead. Whites being made up unironically to look like other races were quite common, even in the 80s. Think about Fisher Stevens in Short Circuit, or Joel Grey as Master Chun in Remo Williams' The Adventure Begins. Hollywood's history during the Hays Code era is replete with examples of makeup being used to make a person of color out of a white person. The right loves to portray itself as realistic, as facing the hard truths, but many times I think they gloss over inconvenient realities in favor of the world they want to revive. Both they and their critics often hearken to the clean cut white male men were men and women were women art style to represent that kind of conservatism. But was the world ever actually like that? Or was there plenty going on underneath the surface that the heavily sanitized media of the times didn't confront the viewers or readers with? It's always easy to harken back to an age that seems simple to us and pretend that going back to that age will render things simple once again. Unfortunately, then as now, the past is always, in all ways, was more complicated than we youngins remember. We just didn't have to deal with those complications. It's context that lets us figure out what's made up, what's not, and whose biases inform what stories. But both the stories and their contextual surrounding documents have the same kind of risk of decay that all aspects of civilization. Just look at your own collection of paperbacks or your older phones or equipment. Look at the files on your computer. How many of them no longer have a program that can recognize and play them? Even with the advent of digital media and perfect copies, information and stories get lost. How much worse was it when the vast majority of people were illiterate, when only a select few things were set down, when the vast majority of stories were told and remembered, and told over and over again by word of mouth? So, without context, 3,000 years in the future, after a civilizational collapse and then resurrection, and then another 3,000 years of attrition for documents, how much actual history do we have left to speak of the events of the Odyssey's time, of the Odyssey's dramatis personae? Not much, actually. Worse yet, thanks to documentary attrition, we don't even have the full story of the epic. We have neither the conclusion nor the beginning. It's as if we're looking at Robert Jordan's The Wheel of Time and have only the fires of heaven and the knife of dreams, or at Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles and we only have the Queen of the Dead and Mimnock the Devil. What we have is great, dramatic enough to evoke admiration, but oh, to have the complete box set of the epic cycle. Another commenter I've seen later has pointed out has pointed out that getting the historical facts wasn't even Homer's job. Homer was a poet. There's a reason the phrase poetic license exists. I mean, so how many lens and filters are we seeing the facts we're supposed to so assiduously stick to? How many are we seeing this through? And is the period even visually recognizable to the average audience member as being Greek? I bet you if I showed you the Mycenaean armor of the time, if I showed these people that and said it was Sumerian or Hittite armor, how many people would just nod and believe me? I mean, it's not even just the Hollywood embellishment filters that we're looking through. We also see the Iliad and the Odyssey through centuries worth of later Greek and Roman representations, whether that's mosaics on some wall or floor or a fresco painted thereof. The Renaissance influence on how we picture antiquity in the classical era adds the distortions and conventions on top of that. That's part of why you don't see historically accurate designs in many productions of that period in Greco Roman history. We have a chain of representations, interpretations, both deliberate and inadvertent, starting with a poet composing an epic that is 300 years after the fact, proceeding with centuries of reproduction in art during the archaic and classical periods, which then becomes itself obscured by a new dark age, um, the dark age after the Roman Empire. And the painted statues become bare marble, the painted temples become bare marble, and the people in the Renaissance imitate that. We're not even looking at we're not even looking at things as they really had them. But would we recognize them if they weren't laid out like that? Would we be going, oh, they're just doing fanciful stuff with with that armor, with that they're just doing funky, lame stuff with that. You know, as much as I can understand why some people don't like that suit of armor that Agamemnon goes around and it you know it kind of somewhat is recognizable in the Greco-Roman tradition. Um, so historical accuracy, it's a lovely concept that we can see that we who can see actual videos and read actual accounts of figures that recent to our own history can champion. In this day and age where everybody gets a copy of all the stories and you have all the lore resources you could ever want, and scholarship by the learned who can tell you the facts about everything, we can be very accurate to what went on. Not perfectly accurate, but somewhat we're in the ballpark. We have no such grace when it comes to the real world events and people that ultimately inspired the Iliad and the Odyssey. We only just in the last couple centuries learned that Troy actually existed. Before that, the city was as lost as many of the volumes of the story that described its fall. Before that, its sister city among the classics was Atlantis. We are used to knowing or being able to know just about everything about events. We're not used to an aching lack of knowledge, the darkness of time swallowing up the memory of civilization. The Odyssey is just that, though, An account where the fictionalizations and elaborations that the ancient poets might add serve to obscure the original accounts and the people of the stories just the same way dirt and vegetation obscure the destroyed ruins. Yes, it would be interesting to do period accurate costumes, but how recognizably Greco-Roman would they be? And can people even tell the difference? Folks looking at the Odyssey ship complained that they looked like Viking ships. They wanted triremes, except triremes are the invention of an even later age. Viking ships, among other kinds, all look very similar. They didn't have the sophistication of later nautical forms. And what about the race and appearance of characters? I bet you that if we just filled the cast the way 1950s Central Casting did, we wouldn't hear a peep out of Elon Musk or any of the high priests of nerd rage online, because to them, those casting decisions are realistic. I don't think they would have even begun complaining about the lack of Greek actors if we hadn't kidded them about how little concerned they were about them. When people complain about DEI, they often miss how DEI reality really was. Like I said before, there's a lost book of the epic cycle that details a bunch of black soldiers coming to fight in the Trojan Wars. Additionally, in Greek myth, Andromeda, Perseus's love interest, like Clash of the Titans Perseus, is portrayed in the text as being Ethiopian, black, in other words. You didn't hear a peep out of those people when Andrada was cast as a white person. Why didn't they object in the name of historical accuracy? Because they're not objecting in the name of everybody's history, just their own. I wonder if you ask the average Greek of Alexander the Great's time whether they consider the Odyssey history, whether they give you the same look that you might give a time traveler who asks about when the great Tony Stark lived. Would those ancient Greeks give you the same look of befuddlement you might give a person who asked where in New York State the Avengers facility was before it was destroyed in that final battle of the cycle? So when people talk about realism, are they aware of the depths of the irony they've subjected themselves to? Realistic to what? They can talk about making T'Challa white or Martin Luther King when we have visual documentation, motion picture documentation, of what the latter looks like, and can interrogate why Black Panther was written as an African prince by going into the source material around those comics. What do we have of Helen of Troy? Is she even more than a poetic symbol? What happens when people demand historical accuracy where history is actually silent, where no surviving documents attest to a person's existence, only later oral tradition? It's not that this means that there was no Helen, no Odysseus, no Penelope, Paris, or King Priam. It's that any description or impression of them we get could be completely false and we would not know the difference. We're not even given the benefit of St. Paul in the Testament, who could talk to St. Peter, who actually knew Jesus personally. The dramatis personae of the epic cycle of the Iliad and Odyssey were ciphers born of what Homer or whichever poet wrote his words heard from somebody else. There's something like a dozen or more generations between one and the other. Imagine how obscure your understanding of the Revolutionary War would be if you only heard about it through family history. If all people had to teach them about history was word of mouth from their ancestors, what they heard through their parents and grandparents who heard it from their own. That is what any description whatsoever about Helen of Troy comes from, a memory of a memory 10 times over. of what might have been no more than rumor and gossip contemporary to the event. The folks objecting in the name of 1950s central casting being restored never gave a rat's ass about the disconnect between casting blonde, white, Northern Europeans in the role. They were as silent as history about Helen's true appearance, if she had ever had one. They only spoke up when somebody cast a woman who was profoundly and undeniably black. Then it was time to defend Western civilization from DEI. We should ask, what are they truly defending us against? I think they're defending us against the period in our own history where European whites are no longer the default, no longer have privilege over other competitors. Why else post all the photos of Lupita Nyong'o in her most rage-filled moments with the words "Black Helen"? The rage-filled character, by the way, is Clytemnestra, but no worries. She is not allowed to be considered a standard of beauty, because then others might follow suit. She's not allowed to be part of a repertory of actors who can be cast simply because they have a certain charisma or personality for the role. I wonder whether Elon Musk, a man whose family fortune was built on a apartheid bound labor, could stand that. To have a black woman playing anything else than just the designated black roles. The roles that have to be black for historical reasons have to be black in order to put the right cannon fodder in place, etc. Very special edition, very special episode blackness. Criminal mugging the protagonists are doing gangsta virus, violence blackness. Blackness cast on purpose because either the role is deliberately written as black or because they need a warm body to act out the stereotype they want to use. Not, we need a pretty woman and, oh, I like this pretty woman. Others might say we have a responsibility to history, but what history here? Nolan cast pretty liberally from different races, to be quite blunt. Helen was the only example that got the Chuds screaming the loudest. The cast is diverse with ancestry from all over the world. But really, if we were to produce a play in London, one of the tragedies of Euripides, would we do any differently? Would we only cast white actors, or while we're at it, Greek white actors? Greek dramas, Greek tragedies, Shakespeare productions are all cast without much care for matching ancestry to role. Only in specific parts does race truly matter, and even then, creativity can change that. Witness Patrick Stewart playing Othello without blackface makeup, only with the rest of the cast populated with black actors. The producers of that play wanted to emphasize the themes of being the mistrusted minority, the paranoia of being the odd one out. So they found an inventive way to maintain those themes. I would say I think that's the approach that Nolan took to casting the Odyssey, casting it more like like Shakespeare and old Greek plays than attempting some match to history. For if we really think about it, there isn't much history to speak of, and what there is would eliminate many of the casts that people like the critics of the films would suggest. Just look at them praising the cast of Troy, which is full of Northern European actors, including Diane Kruger as Helen. They didn't care a whit about the Hellenic casting of Helen when she was the actor given the role. They don't care, after all their harping about the changes made by Nolan, about the fact that both Agamemnon and Menelaus die at the end of Troy in that movie. That is some canon breaking development there. In fact, ironically, Agamemnon and Menelaus have more canonical fates in Nolan's Odyssey than in the movie Troy. In the movie Troy, Menelaus gets taken out by Hector, the Trojan hero, after he tries to kill Paris, Hector's brother, at the duel that actually takes place in the Iliad. But in the Iliad, this is the interesting part. Paris isn't saved by his brother Hector. Paris is saved by Aphrodite, the goddess, picking him up and carrying him out of the battle. Like swooping in, God from the machine. At the end of the story, Helen of Troy actually escapes with Paris, which is the opposite to what happens in the Odyssey and in the actual it's Menelaus who survives and gets away from Troy with Helen after Troy falls. In Troy, Agamemnon dies after he kills Priam, King Priam, who's played by Peter O'Toole. The guy who plays Agamemnon in that movie, by the way, is Brian Cox. Who chews the scenery wonderfully, but he gets taken out by Briseis, the I think the priestess who he stole from the I think the temple of Apollo, and but refused to give to Achilles as a spoil of war, which is why he hides and sulks in his tent. Um, but it's Briseis who stabs him in the movie. In the classical accounts, of course, it happens as it's portrayed in Nolan's Odyssey. Clytemnestra, Helen's fraternal twin, um, shanks him, and that's long after Troy has fallen and he finally gets back home. Yes, Nolan ventures into modern psychological territory with the way he analyzes Odysseus's guilt and the way people get corrupted by the long war. But he's reframing events that are often standard in how they unfold. Circe is not beautiful and bewitching as her epic poem version is, but she does come across as a powerful and dangerous witch, to be sure. A witch changing you into an animal with a magic wand is kind of old hat kid stuff these days. A witch remolding your flesh in body horror fashion, that's hair raising for a modern audience, fear inducing. Nolan didn't want you to be amused by the transformation. He wanted you to be horrified by it, by the loss of control and form the men experienced. The most famous omission in Nolan's version strikes some as a major flaw, and by this I'm talking about the Polyphemus episode, the Cyclops episode. Um, but I would argue that it represents a filmmaker who understands the need to maintain a consistent tone for modern audiences. The Cyclops of Nolan's Odyssey is like Circe, meant to be taken seriously, not simply be a source of amusement. We've made a well worn trope of jokey wisecracking in the face of danger. Nolan, I believe, was going for a more primal kind of terror and dread here and elsewhere. He didn't want your typical movie monster these days. He wanted something that would keep the audience scared witless and wanted to maintain tension and suspense. Nolan had a certain tone in mind, a certain nightmarish horror vibe, like something out of Alien. He directly quotes Goya's infamous painting of Cronus eating his children, a godlike being that Odysseus' crew is incapable of taking down without getting wholesale slaughtered. The Lastrygonians, the next island over, are also equally implacable as an enemy. They meet a little girl who is as large as a full sized man and whose scream brings giants in plate iron armor. The originals were the opposite of how Nolan portrayed them. naked cannibal giants. But I think Nolan wanted each island or hazard the crew encounters to be in its way its own kind of impossible sort of hazard. These men are simply not prepared to survive these situations, so we aren't shocked when they all eventually die. Odysseus is doing his best to keep them alive, whether it's by devising a plan to sneak out of Polyphemus's lair, lead the retreat from the giants in armor, or talking Circe out of keeping his men animals. The- you know, or when he's dealing with spirits negotiating the impossible choice of Scylla and Charybdis, and finally dealing with the last fatal trap of the island of the bad winds and the sun god's cattle. As his men keep on making mistakes or coming up against unbeatable enemies. Today's audiences don't regard witches or gods and goddesses with the same kind of dread people of times past did. Those people could believe that monsters and evil spirits existed and there were women and divine beings who could really ruin your day if you crossed them. Today we might dread the storm, fear the power of the sea, but we are far less prone to feel that the sea and sky have an intelligence powering them, one that could get on the bad on the one that we could get on the bad side of to our regret. No one, in my view, wants to put us in the shoes or sandals, as it may be, of the warriors sailing home on the Mediterranean who trembles at the crackle of thunder, thinking it might be a being with a grudge against them. The wild sea, the terrifying storm seem personal in Nolan's poetic presentation. Yes, poetic. We can look at film and electronic media as having a certain language. And I think we can also analogize the qualities of prose versus poetry, literalism versus lyricism. We're very much a rationalist and reductionist set of storytellers these days. Having followed the analytic example of Plato, among others, we break things down. We want to know absolute causes and effects. We are creatures of canon and lore, authoritative versions of stories, and not so authoritative versions. This is especially true since newer versions of older tales like Star Wars and Star Trek have arisen separate from their original authors. But to only work from the literal image, from the superficial surface, you lose so much. Good filmmaking has its idiomatic, figurative, poetic, lyrical parts. You're not just giving people, as David Mamet might put it, an uninflected shot that just tells the story. It's a waste of your time and the audience's. Yes, we can be plain in parts, but only so that what's under the surface has something solid to raise itself up on. Nolan is a paradoxical author. He's very much the rationalist. His highly structured plots and scenes are notable for their precision, the way they play with time, place, and situation. But at the same time, he's got a sense of the underlying feel of the story, the meaning freighted within the images and the concepts. He wants people to feel what it's like, see what it's like, and then experience the wonder of a thing, the terror, the horror. Homer's Odyssey was a tall tale to be blunt, to be told to live audiences at a festival. One could compare Odysseus in part to James Bond if we want a sort of ruthless anti-hero figure who uses guile as much as force to survive. So, like Bond, he's a bit of a womanizer, and he's using the technology of the day and trickery to get out of dangerous situations. But we've had so many movies that have wisecracking, wily heroes with guile. The tone of the ending of Guardians of the Galaxy, for example, is reminiscent of that, in that he uses some rather silly behaviors to distract Ronan the user, while Rocky Raccoon assembles the weapon to break the stone free from the Zealot's hammer. That's the kind of tone you can expect from a James Gunn movie. And I like James Gunn movies. I like the recent Superman, but that's not Nolan's kind of jokey. That's he wants things more serious and grounded. You know, and even though that episode with the Cyclops, the nobody joke, the pun with that, the way that the way that kind of makes a joke out of the Cyclops' suffering. Um, it might have showcased Odysseus's tricksy nature, but it would violated the atmosphere of the film, punctured the tension. It's the same reason that in Nolan's Batman movies, the Joker has a Glasgow smile. You want to know how I got these scars? That's the Glasgow smile. Somebody cutting the corners of a person's mouth. And he paints his face rather than having it chemically bleached the way Nicholson's Joker or Jared Leto's Joker probably were. If the content isn't poetic, isn't lyrical, I think the dramatic parts are where Nolan goes wild. Nolan builds an underlying current of kind of had it coming in the story, and we gradually learn about what Odysseus and his moderately sympathetic crew did, building to a reveal where Penelope realizes that the long dreaded sea people might have, in fact, been the war corrupted, callous soldiers returning home, looting and pillaging along the way. Rather than stay behind at the front, the chaos and the destruction from the war follows the soldiers back home. You could even argue that the final showdown suitors is the full expression of that. The veteran Odysseus tears apart the soft, draft dodging, wine guzzling, feast fattened harassers of his wife, paying them back for their breach of their host's hospitality. He might not be the god that the folks of the day feared to be inhospitable to, but he was certainly not the man they should have screwed with, much less do harm to his family, friends, and loyal servants. A more visionist version, perhaps, would have had Odysseus invite Circe over to the party for a bite to eat, and there turn everybody into pigs. But that likely would have gone too far in the direction of Hollywood poetic license for Nolan and his audience. Even so, I bet you she would have considered the human form of those swine to be mere disguises for their true nature. My question for this final section is, who are today's sea people? There, there are still people who think that Elliot Page, the trans gender actor, is playing Achilles. While I would have paid good money to see people's heads pop a la the Kingsman over him playing that character, it tells you something that there are still commenters, whether human or AI, who are still repeating the canard about Achilles being in the movie, much less Page playing him. It's a lie calculated to generate outrage, same as using Clytemnestra's murder face to represent Helen of Troy. You can tell the difference if you've actually seen the movie because her face isn't marked at all. So why lie? Because the cause is worthy, I would suggest that's their idea at least. Drive down the attendance, get people to stay home, to boycott it. Go woke, go broke isn't a statement of natural principle, it's a mission statement. They are looking to cause failures so that it destroys their competing narratives' credibility. The irony is, those people actually undermine their own credibility, especially with those who have seen the film and know its actual events and performances. They do it anyways. Why? Because they're not listening, they're not seeing themselves from the outside. That is a fatal flaw in many groups in social media. It isolates people, builds an insular culture, us versus them, to the point where even intelligent people end up saying and doing pretty stupid things because they get trapped in the rabbit holes without outside reference. Even now, they're alleging all sorts of conspiracies to explain how their guaranteed flop broke records for an R rated film. It's got to be the studio buying up tickets. I saw plenty of people at my showing, by the way. So, no. It's got to be brainwashed audiences. It's got to be not enough because the double secret marketing costs on top of everything make it a flop. I would say that our cinema is undergoing a bit of a Bronze Age collapse. Like the real life example, a natural disaster. The COVID pandemic is partly to blame. But so many of the pathological currents but so are many of the pathological currents of social media and a failing right wing in America. You're just simply not allowed to have fun with a movie if it's got any woke elements. No more letting it roll off your back. You've got to get angry every time Hollywood gets woke and DI because it's your job to save society and Western civilization by being mean to women and black people when they get cast. I know you won't listen to me, but let me put it simply. It ain't your job to save society and civilization. Or to the extent you have a role in that, maybe you can start by stopping the destructive behavior the politics all around you is engaged in. The people claiming to save everything are leading the forces that are causing the most disruption, economic chaos, and healthcare collapses. The old idea of Chesterton's, sorry, my mouth is getting a little dry, of Chesterton's fence comes to mind. You don't take down a fence until you know why it was there in the first place. Unfortunately, these days, MAGAs aren't simply taking down the fence, they're dynamiting the damn thing. The disasters from Trump's actions, though, are piling up. Our culture is suffering from that in a number of ways. One big way is how expensive it is to make anything these days. Inflation has taken the movies that were sustainable back in saner times and hiked the budgets dramatically. The requirements and disasters of COVID also added cost, especially in movies where the stars got COVID and ended up sidelined by it. Tom Hanks on his Elvis movie got a particularly bad case in 2020. But inflation in general is bad for films. It's not a coincidence that the epic movies of the early 60s, after Vietnam, gave way to mid scale movies of the late 60s and early 70s. The cost of creating epics spiked, and the studios made them, making them foundered in, with the high interest rate economics of it all, due to their dependence on borrowed money. On location photography wasn't merely an artistic choice, it was a budgeting choice too. It's not until the late 80s and early 90s that the epics began to return and recover. We're paying a premium because a disaster was allowed to get out of control by men who thought they'd lose face if the desperation of the situation were more broadly understood. The irony is that by letting things out of control, they broke their own economies and killed many more people than they should have. But you won't hear them feeling guilty about it. Their heroes don't accept guilt. Guilt is for losers. The irony, though, is that you're much more apt to continue screw ups if you don't take responsibility for them. If we're going to go broke as a nation or as a civilization, it's going to be because one of the most powerful parties and cultural forces in this country decided that it was going to try and dance between the raindrops on wars, on on the deficit, on the pandemic, and all these other things. But they still got wet. They still got soaked in the rain. So what they're doing now is they're going to take it out on their critics, on their dissenters, on the people who choose differently. There aren't winners leading people to what works. They aren't winners leading people to what works. They're losers trying to distract from how hard they're losing. My feeling is that things will get better. Hollywood is going to have to rediscover the mid-scale movie, learn how to do more effective lower budget features. In the meantime, I think when it does go epic, it's not going to be able to simply put out the same sort of mediocre, soulless garbage of a certain genre. They're going to have to get more soul and more poetry in their movies. More magic. And I think Nolan's movie does that well. And that's the end of the script. So let me kind of go on from there. Um, I've heard recently that they're going for that Elon Musk wants to do either $100 million Mel Gibson directed version. I guess they're going to try and do Homeric Greek. That seems to be Mel Gibson's thing. Whenever he does a movie, it seems like he does it in a foreign language. Like with Apocalypto, he did it with Mayan, with um, with the Passion of the Christ. He did Latin and Aramaic. With Braveheart, he did it, Scottish. I'm kidding, but really, I guess they're going to try and do. Um, I guess they're going to try and do Homeric Greek, perhaps. Or are they going to do the archaic Greek? Are they going to try and do Mycenaean Greek? This is kind of what the problem you get into is that they've got many different languages to choose from because it wasn't all composed in one. It wasn't all put together in one chunk. It's sort of like if they did, and people complain about um, Kevin Costner's English accent in the in the movie Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves. But if they were really trying to be accurate there, they wouldn't be doing an English accent because English accents are actually quite young. Uh, before um, before the split between America and Great Britain, we all sort of spoke like Yosemite Sam. We used to have a shared sort of accent. The received pronounce the RP accent didn't arise until decades after the Revolutionary War. So what would it be doing over in great in 1100s 1200s um, England? No, what you'd have is either Norman French or Old English. You know, the kind that when you read it, you only recognize maybe 1 out of 10 words as being English. Yeah, But they have a problem with him having it, because it's a convention. It's a convention that old, historical British people sound like, have RP or similar sort of accents. So it's a lot of what we treat as being historical fact is in fact historical fiction convention. And I think that's something that we need to realize. I mean, if we want to explore, I mean, what I've seen of Mycenaean armor, I'm not sure that that would translate well to screen. I don't think it would look as. I don't think the look would be that you know well received. I mean, people like their well formed to the body um, metal armor or at least leather plates, molded in a certain way. That's what looks good to people. That thing of having that sort of boar's tusk sort of conical helmet and then this sort of apron of brass parts around you. It doesn't quite look, I think, I'm not even sure that somebody could maneuver well in that, and people want active choreography, which is one thing that Nolan provides in his fights. You know, and it's like, okay, um, it's like, it's entertainment. It's poetic license. I'm screw trying to make it perfectly accurate. I'm going to make it to where you understand this is Greek armor. You understand this is they're going to speak in vernacular in this case. You understand that we're going to do we're going to treat magic as if it's real, as at least in Odysseus's flashbacks, which may indeed be the recollection. I mean, this is sort of the ambiguity that I think Nolan has built into it. I think it serves a sort of a poetic purpose, if you will, that you're not sure whether he's seeing an aspect of it, Athena, um, or whether he's just guilt ridden and he's PTSD hallucinating the priestess who was murdered, during the desecration of the temple. Which is he's guilty about because he was a follower of Athena. He carries around a figure of Athena from before that, and it's like it's. But you're also he's also given a physical object by I think a hood or a sort of a head covering by Athena. And my personal opinion is you can have your pie and eat it too here. You can have Athena be real in the universe of the story. Well, at the same time, she has decided to take a certain form, presenting herself to to Odysseus. And perhaps the other gods could do the same, but it's sort of like they can take a human form, but they're not necessarily going to. I think I like that idea. I think I like the idea of it being, and by the way, I think there's a point near the end where you can ask the question, does Odysseus actually survive his massacre of the suitors? Does he actually survive? He kind of begins to look like he's dying, and then he starts talking about how the songs will be taken up, to describe all these things, and that they're going to escape into the rising sun. And he looks like he's dying for a moment there, but he's sort of then you get the additional shots that have them going off into the west, into the sunset. And I think that was deliberate on Nolan's part. I think he was trying to give a kind of ambiguous point where you could say, okay, that going off into the sunset with with Penelope is the ending he'd like to believe himself even as he dies, that he's telling to Penelope as she sits weeping over him. I think that sort of, there's a poetry to doing things that way, to giving you that sort of, possibility that this is him kind of, you know, giving himself a happily ever after through the telling of a tale, a certain kind of immortality and, you know, further life. I don't know. That's just my sort of theory interpretation of that little bit of ambiguity at the end. But really, if I were to review the movie, I would say I went in expecting a Nolan adaptation. I know this guy's habits. I've seen um, all of his films, save Following, save Dunkirk, save. Let's see, what have I not seen of his? I think Dunkirk is the main one I haven't seen. Otherwise, I've seen just about them all. And he's got a certain style, a certain way of doing things. Um, but you know, I think I don't know whether it's a great film, but it's certainly a film with plenty of passion within it and behind it. This is not a this is not a sort of a meh sort of attempt. This is not, a commercial, a commercially done project. This is something that Nolan put heart and soul into. And I think that's one thing people appreciate about Nolan is that he makes an effort. He's not quite the oh no special effects person, but I think he wants to do more than just the standard CG sort of sweep that some people do. He does a lot. He does a lot of. He has a number of shots when he has these big giant characters where you have this obscuring of the character as they come to lash out. You know, it's. I think it's a very good movie. Whether, on repeat viewing it becomes a favorite like Inception, uh, we'll have to see. But I'm glad I saw it. And I'm glad I can say that I saw it because if there's one thing I dislike, it's people who don't see a film and then proceed to lecture us all about the film's flaws and its casting and whatnot. If you that is a low credibility position to be in, I think. When you don't even bother to experience the film for itself. Film is a thing you experience. The whole point is experience. That's what makes film unique is that it's more of an experience than just a reconstruction of an experience. You're seeing it, you're hearing it. You're not just imagining what you see and hear within the book. So, if you're going whether you also people need to go with an open mind, an open heart. They need to let the film affect them. This isn't being passive in the face of conformity. You're not really being a nonconformist by, you know, undermining your own ability to experience this in favor of what somebody else told you. You know, so what somebody else told you. No, a true nonconformist sees things for themselves, and if they agree, well, you agree. You know, if you like the movie, you like the movie. If you don't like the movie, more power to you. So y'all have a good evening, a good night, and y'all go see it. Go see if Well, if you hadn't seen the Odyssey and you went through this video, obviously I spoiled you terribly. But I told you so. I told you so. I told you. Big spoilers. But if you have seen it, I say watch it again if you can. Not just for the sake of support, you know, but also because some movies are richer on a second viewing. The first viewing is a first draft viewing. Now you do the second, draft, and you refine your appreciation, your experience of the film. So, y'all have a good night and go enjoy the movie.